In the late 1930s, the world stood at the edge of a storm it could not yet imagine. Germany, under Adolf Hitler, had risen from the ashes of the Great War, proud, vengeful, and hungry for power. Across the Atlantic, the United States watched, uncertain whether this new conflict brewing in Europe would ever reach its shores. At first glance, there was no reason for Germany and the United States to be enemies. The Atlantic Ocean separated them by thousands of miles. Trade relations still existed. Some American businessmen even saw Hitler's Germany as a potential bulwark against communism. But beneath that uneasy calm, two men, Adolf Hitler and Franklin D. Roosevelt, were heading toward an inevitable collision of ideologies. One believed in total control, the other in the power of democracy. One saw the world as a battleground between races, the other as a balance between freedom and stability. The collision was not immediate. It was a slow, inevitable drift, a political and moral tectonic shift that would, by 1941, explode into global war. Hitler's vision of a divided world. To understand why Hitler declared war on the United States, we must first step inside his mind, a place built on obsession, hatred, and delusion. Hitler saw history not as a series of nations, but as a struggle between races. He saw himself as the architect of a new world order, one where Germany would dominate Europe, Italy would rule the Mediterranean, and Japan, his distant ally, would command Asia. In his book Mein Kampf, he wrote of America as a corrupted land, a place poisoned by what he called Jewish influence, and weakened by the mixing of races. To him, America was rich but soft, industrial but soulless, a mongrel nation that could never stand against Germany's pure will. This arrogance would define his strategy. He saw America's democracy as fragile, its people as lazy consumers, and its leaders as puppets of finance and propaganda. He would repeat this belief to his generals even in 1941, saying, "The Americans are a race of businessmen. They will not die for ideals," but Hitler's hatred blinded him to the truth that the very diversity and industrial might he despised would one day crush the empire he built. Roosevelt's tightrope. Meanwhile, in Washington, President Franklin D. Roosevelt faced his own impossible dilemma. He understood that Nazi Germany posed a threat to the entire democratic world, but he also knew his own people were not ready to fight another European war. America was still haunted by the blood of World War I. The graves of young soldiers lay silent reminders across the land, and isolationists in Congress shouted, "America first," demanding that the nation stay out of Europe's affairs. Roosevelt moved cautiously like a man walking on thin ice. He expanded the Navy. He began secretly helping Britain through the Lend-Lease Act, sending weapons, planes, and supplies across the Atlantic. He froze German and Italian assets, but officially America was still neutral. Behind closed doors, Roosevelt admitted the truth. We cannot and will not allow Hitler to dominate Europe, but we must wait until the people are ready. And so he waited. Every day, American ships escorted British convoys across the Atlantic. Every week, they grew closer to open conflict with German submarines. The U.S. Navy began firing back when fired upon, and though it wasn't called war, it was war in everything but name. The Atlantic tension. The Atlantic Ocean became a silent battlefield long before Pearl Harbor. German U-boats prowled the dark waters, hunting the convoys that carried Britain's lifeline. American destroyers began escorting those convoys, and soon the inevitable happened. They clashed. In September 1941, the USS Greer was attacked by a German submarine. It was the first time in modern history that an American warship exchanged fire with Germany. A month later, the USS Reuben James was sunk. More than 100 American sailors died in the cold Atlantic. It was still not enough to change public opinion. The isolationists argued that Roosevelt was provoking Germany into war. But inside Berlin, Hitler saw these incidents differently. He viewed them as proof that America was already his enemy. To him, Roosevelt was secretly fighting alongside Britain and the Soviet Union. The fact that the U.S. hadn't formally declared war didn't matter. He told his inner circle, "The United States is already at war with Germany, even if their Congress hasn't realized it yet." The Axis Triangle. By 1940, Germany, Italy, and Japan had signed the Tripartite Pact, creating what they called the Axis of Powers. The idea was simple. If any one of them was attacked by another major power, the others would come to their aid. But there was one critical flaw. The pact only applied if one of them was attacked, not if they started a war. So when Japan planned its secret strike on Pearl Harbor, Berlin had no idea it was coming. In Tokyo, Japanese diplomats kept Hitler in the dark. They wanted to avoid being dragged into Germany's European war. Their target was Asia, the Philippines, the Dutch East Indies, British Malaya, and, of course, the United States. When the bombs fell on Pearl Harbor on December 7, 1941, the world changed overnight. Stunned and furious, declared war on Japan the next day. But Roosevelt did not declare war on Germany. For the first time, the United States was officially at war, but only in the Pacific. In Berlin, this moment sent shockwaves through Hitler's inner circle. He saw it as an opportunity, a chance to strike before America could fully mobilize. Hitler's miscalculation. In the days following Pearl Harbor, Hitler was almost euphoric. He believed Japan's attack was a masterstroke. He imagined that the Americans, humiliated and wounded, would focus entirely on avenging themselves in the Pacific. That would leave Britain isolated and the Soviet Union collapsing under his armies in the East. To him, Japan's entry into the war was the final piece of his grand puzzle, the proof that destiny was on his side. He told his generals that Japan would soon attack British colonies in India, and perhaps even invade the Soviet Union from the east. He saw this as the perfect moment to tie Germany's fate to Japan's. But he misunderstood both the enemy and his allies. The Japanese had no intention of fighting in Europe. They wanted dominance in Asia, and saw Hitler's European war as a distraction. Meanwhile, the Americans, though shocked, were not defeated. Factories began roaring to life within hours of Roosevelt's speech. The same industry that built cars, radios, and refrigerators now began producing tanks, bombers, and rifles. Hitler believed the United States lacked the will to fight. He was wrong. He had just awakened a sleeping giant. Inside the Reich Chancellery. On December 9, 1941, Hitler summoned his closest advisor to the Reich Chancellery. The atmosphere was tense but charged with confidence. He had already made up his mind. He would declare war on the United States. Foreign Minister Joachim von Ribbentrop, ever cautious, hesitated. He warned Hitler that the United States was industrially unstoppable, that its resources dwarfed those of the Axis combined, that Germany could not afford another major enemy. But Hitler dismissed him with contempt. He claimed that Roosevelt was already plotting against Germany, arming Britain, aiding the Soviets, attacking U-boats. Declaring war, he said, would only formalize what was already happening. More dangerously, he believed this declaration would draw Japan even closer. If he stood with them, he thought, they would strike at Britain's colonies and Soviet positions, dividing the Allies and overwhelming them. It was the logic of a gambler, not a general. And yet, no one in that room dared to object. The machinery of dictatorship had erased dissent. Whatever Hitler decided, the nation would obey. The curtain rises. By the morning of December 11th, the stage was set. Cameras were arranged inside the Grand Reichstag building. Reporters from around the world filled the seats, waiting for what they assumed would be another fiery speech against Roosevelt. They were about to witness something far more consequential. At 3 p.m., Hitler entered, dressed in military gray, his eyes blazing with manic confidence. He spoke for over an hour. He accused Roosevelt of conspiracy, of arming Germany's enemies. of forcing the world into chaos. His words were venomous, his tone triumphant. He told his audience that Germany would stand shoulder to shoulder with Japan, and that history would judge the United States as the true aggressor. At 3:30 p.m., the German government handed its official declaration of war to the American chargé d'affaires in Berlin. It was done. The die was cast. In one moment of arrogance, Germany had turned the world's greatest industrial power into its most determined enemy. The sleeping giant stirs. Across the ocean, President Roosevelt received the news calmly. For months, he had waited for Germany to make the first move. Now, Hitler had given him exactly what he wanted, a reason to unite the American people behind a total war effort. On December 11th, Roosevelt addressed Congress once again. He asked for a declaration of war against Germany and Italy. The resolution passed within hours. America was now at war on two fronts, in Europe and in the Pacific. Factories thundered to life. Men enlisted in droves. The industrial engine of democracy roared into motion. What Hitler had dismissed as a nation of businessmen was now transforming into the arsenal of freedom. Hitler's declaration of war on the United States was not a tactical maneuver. It was an act of pride, a statement of defiance against a world he could no longer control. He believed his destiny was unstoppable. He believed that fate favored the bold. But in truth, he had just signed the death warrant of his own empire. As the winter of 1941 deepened, the German army froze outside Moscow. British bombers struck back harder than ever, and far across the Atlantic, a sleeping giant was fully awake. The stage was set for the second act, the war that would destroy Hitler's dream and end the Nazi Reich. The day the world changed. December 11th, 1941. Inside the Grand Reichstag, the air was thick with smoke and pride. Adolf Hitler's speech had just ended. He smiled faintly as the room erupted in applause, a performance of loyalty that concealed the quiet dread of many who sat before him. At that moment, few in Germany truly understood what had just happened. The Führer had declared war on the United States of America, a country that had not yet fired a shot against him. The crowds cheered, the newspapers roared with patriotic headlines, but in the minds of those who understood the reality of global war, there was a chilling silence. Because on that December afternoon, Germany's fate was sealed. Hitler had made the single most catastrophic decision of his career, Hitler's delusion of power. In Hitler's mind, it wasn't madness, it was destiny. He saw himself as a master strategist, a man guided by fate rather than logic. He told his inner circle that Roosevelt had already declared war in practice. He spoke of American destroyers firing on German U-boats, of Lend-Lease supplies arming Britain and the Soviets. To him, the United States was already fighting Germany, just without the courage to say it aloud. He convinced himself that by declaring war, he was seizing the initiative, showing strength, not weakness. But the truth was different. His generals knew Germany's resources were stretched to the limit. In the east, the army was trapped in the snows of Russia, bogged down outside Moscow with frostbitten hands and broken tanks. The Luftwaffe was exhausted. The Navy, tiny compared to Britain's, was bleeding ships in the Atlantic. And yet Hitler believed he could take on the world's most industrialized nation, because arrogance had replaced reason. He once said, "If the American people had any strength, they would not have allowed Jews and Negroes to mix their blood." It was racism masquerading as strategy, and it blinded him completely. Ribbentrop's warning. Not everyone in Berlin agreed. Foreign Minister Joachim von Ribbentrop tried to resist. He warned Hitler that the United States had resources beyond imagination, that its factories could produce tanks and planes faster than Germany could destroy them. He argued that Japan's attack did not require Germany's support under the Tripartite Pact. He pleaded, "My Führer, This could be the biggest mistake of the war. But Hitler would not listen. In his mind, the alliance with Japan would now be complete. He fantasized about Japan attacking British India and Soviet Siberia, forcing Stalin to divide his forces and giving Germany the chance to finish its conquest of Russia. This, he believed, would bring total victory. But Japan had other plans. They were not interested in fighting the Soviet Union. They wanted to dominate Asia, not Europe. Their war was for empire, not ideology. And so, while Hitler expected his new partner to open a second front against the Soviets, Tokyo ignored him completely. Chapter 4. The American Response. In Washington, the reaction was swift and unified. When news arrived that Germany had declared war, President Roosevelt looked up from his papers and said calmly, "Now all the pieces fit together." For months, he had tried to prepare the nation for war in Europe. Now, Hitler had made the choice for him. The very next day, Roosevelt addressed Congress. He spoke not with anger, but with quiet determination. He declared that the Axis powers had made a fatal miscalculation. They had mistaken America's patience for weakness. Congress responded with overwhelming approval. Within hours, the United States was at war with Germany and Italy. From coast to coast, the nation mobilized. Factories shifted overnight from producing consumer goods to weapons of war. Men lined up to enlist. Women filled the assembly lines. Within a year, the United States was producing more airplanes, tanks, and ships than Germany, Italy, and Japan combined. Hitler had not only gained a new enemy, he had awakened the most powerful industrial machine the world had ever seen, the arsenal of democracy. By mid-1942, the United States was transformed. The entire nation had become what Roosevelt called the arsenal of democracy. American factories produced one bomber every hour. Tanks rolled off assembly lines by the thousands. Liberty ships carried supplies across the Atlantic faster than U-boats could sink them. And with that industrial might came the ultimate weapon: time. The United States had the power to fight a long war. Germany did not. Every month that passed, America grew stronger, while Germany grew weaker. Hitler's decision had united Britain, the Soviet Union, and the United States into a global alliance, one that would never stop until Berlin fell. In his private moments, Roosevelt told his staff, "This is a war of machines, and we will outbuild them." He was right. By 1944, American forces were landing in Europe, and the Luftwaffe was no longer master of the skies. The industrial and moral weight of the United States became the hammer that broke the Nazi Empire. The turning tide. In 1942, the war began to shift. The German army, once unstoppable, was now fighting on too many fronts. In the east, the Soviets launched counteroffensives that pushed the Wehrmacht back from Moscow. In North Africa, British and American troops fought Rommel's forces. In the Atlantic, the tide turned as Allied convoys began overwhelming the U-boats. Hitler's decision had brought upon himself a nightmare scenario: a global war on every horizon. He blamed everyone but himself, his generals, his allies, the weather, even fate. But deep down, the truth gnawed at him. His gamble had failed. The dream of a 1,000-year Reich was already crumbling, and the Americans had barely begun their assault. Inside Hitler's mind. By late 1942, Hitler's speeches changed tone. The confidence of earlier years was gone. He spoke less of victory and more of sacrifice. His obsession with the United States became personal. He ranted about Roosevelt being controlled by Jews and bankers. He told his staff that America was a land of degenerates that would collapse under the weight of its own population. But reports from his own intelligence officers told a different story. American bombers were appearing over German skies, American supplies were flooding Soviet armies, and American troops were preparing to land in North Africa. Hitler's war had become global, and his enemies were now limitless. Still, he refused to believe he was wrong. He clung to the fantasy that some miracle weapon, some act of fate, would turn the tide back in his favor, but history does not reward fantasy. The cost of arrogance. The cost of Hitler's declaration was beyond measure. Between 1942 and 1945, American and Allied bombers reduced German cities to rubble. Factories burned, transport collapsed, and by 1944, even fuel was running out. Meanwhile, the Eastern Front consumed millions of lives. The Wehrmacht fought desperately to hold back the Red Army, but with American support pouring into Russia through the Lend-Lease program, the Soviet machine grew unstoppable. Every truck, every rifle, every ton of food helped the Soviets push Germany back toward Berlin. In the end, the United States didn't just join the war, it funded the end of the Reich. Without America's entry, the Allies might have faltered, Britain might have starved, and the Soviet Union might have fallen. But with Hitler's reckless declaration, the world united against him, and his downfall became inevitable. The final years. By 1944, the war Hitler had started was consuming him. The once invincible Führer was now a recluse, hiding in his bunker as bombs fell over Berlin. His empire had shrunk to ashes. His allies had turned into burdens. Japan was losing in the Pacific, Italy had surrendered, and his generals were secretly plotting against him. In April 1945, as Soviet troops closed in, Hitler spent his final days raving about betrayal and fate. He still spoke of Roosevelt and the Americans, still convinced that somehow they had cheated destiny. But in truth, it was his own arrogance, his own hand, that had brought ruin to Germany. On April 30th, 1945, Hitler took his own life in the Führerbunker. Outside, Berlin was in flames. American, British, and Soviet flags flew over a continent liberated from tyranny. The legacy of a fatal decision. The question remains, why did Hitler declare war on the United States? The answer is not strategy. It is hubris, the belief that ideology could replace reality. He thought he understood the world better than anyone else. He thought the Americans were weak, the Soviets doomed, the British exhausted. He believed destiny favored him. But history does not bow to ego. The moment he declared war on the United States, he turned a regional conflict into a global crusade against himself. Within 3 years, his empire was gone. Within 4, Germany lay divided, its cities shattered, its people broken. It was a war he could never win. Started by a man who could never admit he was wrong. The lesson of 1941. December 11th, 1941, a date far less remembered than Pearl Harbor, but one that changed the course of history just as profoundly. In that moment, Adolf Hitler believed he was acting from strength. He believed he was declaring dominance, but in truth, he was writing the first line of his own obituary. For when Germany declared war on the United States, it declared war on the future. It set in motion a chain of events that would end not in victory, but in fire and surrender. From the ashes of that decision, a new world emerged, one led not by fear and conquest, but by the collective will to ensure such madness would never return. And so, the answer to the question, why did Germany declare war on the United States, is both simple and tragic, because one man's pride was greater than his understanding of reality.